Kidney diseases have plagued villages of Madukare for many years. For 335 families that once relied on impure water, there's some hope. A water purification project by Gunatilleke. Gunatilleke, for the people, by the people.
Newsfirst, Newsline.
Hello there, a very good evening and welcome to another edition of Newsline Live. Of course, as you can see, we're coming to you today live via Zoom online because, of course, the current situation in the country and because of the challenges that we've been facing. Of course, it's a known fact that many people are facing issues due to the fuel crisis in the country and also power outages. And today, we'll be bringing you Newsline Live online. Let me start off with introducing our guest for this evening, Dr. Gehan Gunatilleke, attorney at law. Doctor, a very good evening and thank you very much for joining this edition of Newsline via Zoom.
Thanks for having me on the show again, Chalan. Nice to be on the show. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Doctor. And of course, we need to cope with the current situation in the country, despite things that are happening around us. We need to move forward. And we as Newsfirst, as a responsible news organization, want to keep our viewers and the general public up to date on the current situation in the country. And that is why, despite all the difficulties that we're facing, we're coming to you live. Personally, even I don't have power at my place. So I cycled down to my friend's place and we were here. And Doctor, today, we are facing a wave of economic crises coming in the form of fuel crisis, the power crisis, a political crisis, a social crisis to be exact. But amidst all of this, there is a massive wave of protest from the people who have been suffering for maybe a long time, but now it's really hit them as to how wrong we have been throughout the past years as far as managing Sri Lanka as a community go. And in light of these protests, there have been many arrests that have been made. Of course, some arrests were of protesters that did get violent, but the general perception is that a majority of these arrests are arbitrary arrests. There have been several fundamental rights applications filed. So today's episode will be dedicated to educating protesters or people who want to voice their protest against whatever is happening and to exercise their fundamental right and freedom of speech. Dr. Gehan Gunatilleke, my first question to you is, what will be defined as violent protests and what gives the police that point at which police can go and arrest, saying, this is an unlawful assembly, you can't be here. Is there any definition given by law?
Yeah, that's a really important question because the law isn't clear on what is an unlawful protest. And it is assumed that unlawful protest would be a protest that, for example, there's a court order against, or a protest that clearly has violence as part of the sort of methodology of the protest. But apart from that, it's very important to remember that ultimately the freedom of peaceful assembly, the freedom to protest, is a fundamental right that's guaranteed by the Constitution. And that fundamental right entails the ability to protest peacefully, that is without violence. So the real condition is non-violence. Apart from that, all protests are lawful by virtue of the Constitution, constitutional protection that is offered to all citizens. So I think that's the first principle. Now, if there is an unlawful protest, the police has to follow the procedure, right, laid out in the law. It can't just go and use force to suppress a protest unless it is the last resort. It can't simply arrest individuals who are in the vicinity because they think that they might have participated in the protest. There has to be some reasonable cause to arrest an individual. So there's a whole procedure that has been laid out in the law And the police has a duty to follow that procedure very carefully. And one of the principles that the law upholds is that any use of force has to be absolutely necessary and proportionate. So that those are the principles that govern police conduct in this context. But that's only in the context of unlawful protests. So the protest has to be unlawful to begin with in order for the police to act on it. And if the police can act on it, it has to act proportionately and has to only act when it's absolutely necessary.
So, Doctor, generally, just to put this into perspective, the police has a certain level of discretion that they have to use when defining or deciding whether a protest is unlawful or whether an assembly is unlawful when they are on the location. Because even if a protest or an assembly starts as a lawful assembly, starts as a lawful protest, it can turn violent, at which point it becomes an unlawful protest. So just to lay the foundation for this entire discussion, the police exercises a serious amount of discretion when they deem a protest to be unlawful.
I don't think the police has discretion there. The police has to actually act objectively. So when you say the police has discretion, then there's a subjective element to that. And I think we have to reject that possibility that the police can act subjectively. The police can't come to some kind of understanding or conclusion that a protest that is lawful is actually unlawful. There needs to be an objective reality there. And that objective reality has to be observable. So it has to be, for example, clear use of violence, clearly destruction of property taking place in a particular site. And then the police can act because the police has an objective set of circumstances that give it authority to act under those circumstances. Now, apart from that, the police may also get an order from a judge saying that a particular site cannot be a protest site, or an injunction against certain actors attending protests or attending a public assembly. Then their attendance becomes unlawful by virtue of that order. So again, there is no discretion here. There is the enforcement of a judicial order in those circumstances. So I think really at the end of the day, there needs to be an objective reality of violence, an objective reality of destruction or damage to property where the police can act, or some kind of court order that is again an objective reality. So I think at the end of the day, we cannot trust law enforcement to really exercise discretion in good faith. We just don't have that history. We don't have the track record of police acting like that. So I don't think we can begin to just say that the police has discretion in this context. Ultimately, the citizen has to be served by the law, not the other way around. And I think the law enforcement officials have a duty to citizens and a duty to the Constitution that ultimately they have to fulfill. And in that context, if citizens step outside the conditions or step outside the parameters under which you can exercise your fundamental rights, then the police has a duty to intervene and maintain law and order.
So, Doctor, I'd like to direct your attention to some of the things that people themselves have been doing during these protests to ensure that their rights are protected, to ensure that they are not subject to police abuse, to make sure simply that they themselves are protected both before the law and also physically, because there have been a number of injured people. But during these protests, there have been a number of deaths that were reported. So speaking a little bit about what the people generally do during these protests, the one common thing that they do is they take out their cell phones and they start recording. There were instances where people went on Facebook Lives, or they went live on social media when these arrests were taking place. Now, there was a single incident that was reported recently at a fuel station, during a queue at a fuel station, where there were allegations that the police began assaulting the protesters. There was also a scenario that was painted that the protesters were the ones who initially became violent. But besides that point, in general, the matter that I want to focus your attention on is the fact that certain people began taking out their phones and recording, as usual, as people do these days. And they were informed by the police, don't take out your phones, don't record what is happening. Is this a legal order?
No, I don't think that's a legal order at all. I mean, if you own a device, you're free to use that device as you please, as long as you're not violating someone else's rights, someone else's privacy, for example. So you can use your device to record something that's happening to you, but you certainly can't walk into someone's home and use a device against those people's wishes.
So you can record in a public place.
I think you can record in a public place if you're recording something that is happening to you. But if you're even in a public place, if you're recording someone else, I think there is a professional courtesy, if you're a journalist, for example, to get the consent of the individual. And there's an ethical duty to get consent in general if you're recording someone else's behavior. But if you are recording something as a defensive measure to make sure that your rights are not being violated by someone else, if you are recording for the purpose of gathering evidence, in case something goes wrong in that context, I think that is perfectly within the law. In fact, it is probably advisable because it's a way of making sure that someone who can abuse the law, if they're not being recorded, will not abuse the law because they're worried that there'll be evidence against them. So if someone turns around and says, don't record, I think immediately you have to ask the question, why not record? What are you going to do that you don't want recorded? And immediately that question has to be asked. And often I have seen in context, particularly when arrests take place, the recording ensures that the officers operate within the law with restraint, because they'll obviously be worried that if they step outside those parameters of the law, they could get in trouble. So I think the advent of social media, the use of recording devices, all of this has helped in certain ways in terms of ensuring that citizens' rights are respected, even during a lawful arrest, right? So I would say that this is perfectly normal behavior. It's a behavior that is meant to protect yourself from possible abuse, because let's face it, Shalan, I mean, we don't have a very good track record in terms of how the police has behaved in this country, right? So it's natural for people to not trust the police. Of course, I have said before on this program that it sometimes depends on context. It depends on the local police station. It depends on who the officer is. There are a lot of good officers out there as well. But I think if you look at the broader trends of the institution of law enforcement, it's very natural for people to distrust the police. And that is why they pull out their phones. And this doesn't happen just in Sri Lanka, it happens all over the world. And it is those phone recordings, those video recordings, that is often used as evidence in cases of abuse. This happens in the United States all the time. So I think that is just the reality in which the citizen and the police officer now interact. And we have to just accept that as the new reality.
Dr. Gehan, Gunatilleke, speaking about the track record of the police and the trust that the people face or the people have in the police department, it's important that people trust in these institutions. There is always the social contract that needs to be preserved. And as far as Sri Lanka's context goes, I think it's anyone's guess that the social contract has been breached to a certain degree. And this is even evident with certain statements that were made by the Inspector General of Police himself, when he said that out of the 184 appointments to the office of the OIC of various divisions in the country, 182 of those appointments were political appointments. And this definitely shouldn't be the case. So in reality, what the Inspector General of Police is saying is that he was only able to make 2 appointments to the office of the OIC, which is the head of the police department in that specific jurisdiction. So as far as this goes, I mean, the facts do agree with what you say, Dr. Gunatilleke. Dr. Gunatilleke, one more thing that a lot of Sri Lankans face when they do take out their phone and do start recording is the threat of their cell phones or mobile devices or whichever device that they are recording on, either being destroyed, less number of cases on that, but being impounded. So Dr. Gunatilleke, we will cross over to a short commercial break now. Sure. On the other side, we will discuss on what people who are recording a police officer, recording an incident that is happening to them for their protection, if they have their phones impounded, what can they do? What are the legal channels that they can access? And how can they react on that specific situation? So stay tuned for the details. We will be right back after this short commercial break. Don't go anywhere. You're watching Newsline Live.
Newsfirst, Newsline.
Hiruniga goes to the Prime Minister's residence. Why can't Sri Lanka purchase oil from Russia? Scuffles in fuel queues. Why did Dudley lose his temper? Parliament gets a new MP. Sri Lanka sued in the United States. A 30-year-long wait for Sri Lankan cricket fans.
This will be taken, and is, and Sri Lanka win the match and the series. To send.
Newsfirst, Newsline.
Welcome back. You're watching Newsline Live. If you are just joining us and if you weren't with us before the break, we're in discussion with Dr. Gehan Gunatilleke, attorney at law. Dr. Gehan is joining us from the United Kingdom, and I'm joining you from my friend's residence due to the current situation in the country. But of course, we will continue to keep you up to date on the latest that is happening in Sri Lanka. Today's discussion was focused around how protests should be held, how protesters should respond to a situation that they find themselves in if the police arrives and begins or initiates a process to arrest them. Doctor, we were speaking about the use of mobile devices to record police officers or a certain incident, and we went along that road. We then promised our viewers that we will discuss of the course of action or the recourse that is available to citizens if their mobile devices are impounded by the police officers. Now, one fact that we know is that police officers are vested with the power to impound certain devices, but under what circumstances? And speaking generally, if a person is standing at a protest, recording what is happening, and a police officer comes and says, stop recording, you are not allowed to record, and the protester questions, like you advised, why should I stop recording? What are you going to do that is, that shouldn't be recorded? And the police officer simply proceeds to impound the phone. What then? What do people do?
So it all depends on context, Shalan. Ultimately, a police officer can give you instruction in public, and refusing to follow that instruction in itself could be the basis of an offense, right? So the law is not on the citizen side often in these circumstances, because we have all kinds of broad offenses that can be deployed in bad faith, right? So I think the practical advice is different to the legal advice. The practical advice is always to try and de-escalate, always try and make sure that you don't escalate a situation in which you antagonize a law enforcement official. These people are also human. A lot of them are good people. A lot of them are ordinary folks who are just doing a job. So
simply following orders.
Simply following orders, or simply following what they think might be their duty. So essentially, I think de-escalating a situation and ensuring that you don't lose your phone because you actually have an altercation or you are hostile towards the officer. That's, I think, the practical advice anyone should follow. But if you do have your phone impounded, there has to be a reason for that. People can't have your property just confiscated without some kind of legal basis. Often that is a court order that is required to confiscate someone's property. It has to be part of a particular investigation. It has to be something that is suspected of being used in an offense. It certainly can't be just confiscated for the sake of it. So the legal route is also available for citizens, but unfortunately that legal route is often long-winded, it's complicated, it might be a while before you get your device back. So again, always think of the practical reality. Always think of de-escalation. Always realize that you're interacting with another human being, and try and ensure that you don't, lose your property in the process. It's much easier to say, sorry, I won't do it, and just move on, than to get into an altercation in a heated discussion, particularly when we know the history of violence in this country, and you shouldn't put yourself in that situation unless you really have no other choice. And I think that kind of altercation should be avoided, particularly when you're in a public protest site, when the tension is very high, and a lot of things could go wrong.
Doctor, your point as far as the de-escalation of the situation goes is well taken. But on your other piece of advice, so if a police officer comes up to you and says, stop recording, you're not supposed to record, so your advice would be to stop recording and move on from there, even if there is a risk of maybe these situation escalating and something illegal happening in the process?
So this is why I said it's important to apply the advice in terms of the context. Now, if you're recording to protect your own rights there, for example, if someone is attempting to make an arbitrary arrest and you are the victim here, recording is something that you are doing because you have no choice and you must record in order to protect your interests there. But say you're recording something else that's going on, or you're recording, an event taking place, and you're asked to not record. Now, you might have a right to record that event, but you have to make a choice as to whether the event is important enough to record versus you just complying and keeping your phone. So again, context matters. Now, if, for example, violence is taking place and you're observing brutality against fellow protesters and you're recording that, and then someone comes up and says, don't record it. Of course, there you have to make a choice, because even though there's a risk to your person as a result of this individual, maybe a police officer coming and saying, don't record, you're doing something that is very important, because you're recording an incident that is unlawful, that is an abuse of power. So then you might want to make the choice of taking the risk. So again, as I said, there's no easy fit here. It's all context specific. And if there's an opportunity to de-escalate, given these, competing interests, then de-escalate. But if the moral imperative is to continue, then you must continue. That's the citizen's duty there.
Dr. Gehan, Gunatilleke, there was a video that went viral quite recently. I'm pretty sure you would have seen it as well, about a situation at a fuel station in Sri Lanka where, according to the video, of course, it was of a police officer walking into a fuel queue where people were standing on motorbikes, grabbing a person by his helmet, assaulting him, asking his subordinate police officers to arrest him. And the subordinate police officer goes on to wrap his arm around this person's neck. There were certain parallels drawn with this incident and the George Floyd incident in the United States. But of course, the end result wasn't as bad as the George Floyd incident in the United States. But then the video goes on to show this police officer drawing his weapon on unarmed citizens. Now, there has always been a debate on what is minimum force. Sometimes there are contradictory statements even put out by the police department when they issue a clarification regarding a certain incident where police officers have drawn their weapons, when they issue a statement saying, police used minimum force. Then the immediate question that pops up is, if drawing your firearm is minimum force, what would be maximum force? There seems to be a little bit of muddled water in this regard. So what is minimum force and what is maximum force?
Sure. So this is again a difficult question to answer, because you're seeing a particular clip, right? You're not seeing the entire episode taking place. So you're seeing a little part of a longer story, right? And then the story that you're seeing is the escalation of violence, or escalation of the tensions into a situation where the police officer clearly loses his cool and clearly steps outside the remit of what is reasonable, right? So I would say, given what we are viewing, it didn't seem like his actions were reasonable or proportionate at all, because I would ordinarily think that drawing your weapon should be done only in a context when there is a threat of a similar nature being posed to you. So, for example, if there's a chase taking place and the suspect draws out a weapon and aims it at the police officer, or draws out some other weapon and attempts to attack the police officer, and then he draws out his weapon, that may seem like a reasonable response to the context. But it didn't seem like that particular incident required a weapon to be unholstered and waved about. And I would say minimum force was not used there. But I say that with the caveat that I'm only seeing a particular, clip of a longer incident. And I think certainly that sort of incident needs to be investigated impartially. And if it is found that the officer involved did act outside his remit, then certain disciplinary action needs to take place. But if it is found that certain things that were not captured on video took place that justified that kind of response, then I think the outcome is going to be different. So it all depends on what took place. But I would say, like in lots of other contexts, like in the US, police officers seem to be very quick to pull out their weapon and pull out a deadly weapon. And that could be a means of intimidation, or it could be a means of actually wanting to use it against a citizen. In the United States, often police officers use that as a first resort, as opposed to a last resort. And that is in a context where a lot of citizens also carry weapons, right? So it's a different context. So I don't see a justification in a place like Sri Lanka, where you don't have citizens carrying weapons, police officers being so anxious and activated by a context like that to actually draw their weapon out. So again, it seemed like it was a completely disproportionate response.
Dr. Gehan, Gunatilleke, also this story regarding the revelation made by the Inspector General of Police himself, that 182 OICs of police jurisdictions in the country were appointed based on political whims and fancies, and that he only got to appoint 2 OICs of police stations, has really been swept under the carpet for the longest time. This really puts a dent in the trust placed by the public in the law enforcement authorities that they are supposed to go to, or that they're supposed to inform when they are facing a crisis or a situation, or some unlawful activity, or being the victim in a certain incident. So on these grounds, do you think enough has been done by maybe the executive and the legislature of the country to address this? Because it's very unlikely that they didn't know about this situation, because they were the ones directly responsible for this. But regarding the response that has been made to this situation, doesn't it just compound the distrust that the public has in this department?
You're absolutely right. And I think this is a broader problem of good faith, right? Because I think this government, the present government, like many Sri Lankan governments of the past, does not want to operate in good faith. I think it doesn't even know how to. And it sees every context as just another opportunity to further its own interests and undermine those who oppose those interests. And the police has, and law enforcement agencies generally, have become sort of a tool for the furthering of governmental interests as opposed to public interests. And that is the reality that we're seeing, not just in law enforcement, but in all sectors of the public service. So it's a much deeper problem, because ultimately those who wield governmental power see public institutions as just entities that are there as receptacles for their interests and methods or modalities to further their interests. So the law, unfortunately, has become a tool that can be deployed by the government opportunistically. And we've seen this with the emergency law. We've seen it with ordinary law as well, with the arrests of all these protesters. So we have to remember, Shalan, that the law is really there to serve the public, not the other way around. People have sovereignty, right? And that is the sovereignty that flows to all governmental power. Unfortunately, we're seeing a role reversal here, and the law has become less of a shield and more of a weapon.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gehan Gunatilleke, for putting that so succinctly for the general public. We are unfortunately out of time and we have to cross over to primetime news on TV1. So to all our viewers, do stay tuned. Once again, thank you very much, Dr. Gehan Gunatilleke, for joining us from the United Kingdom. And thank you very much to all our viewers out there also for tuning in. And until we meet again, of course, heed the advice of Dr. Gehan Gunatilleke, who is, of course, an expert in his field. And always stay safe when you voice your protest regarding anything that is taking place in this country. Until we meet again, take care and God bless.
Thanks.